2026 started off strong for horror fans with the release of Primate, and today we're talking with the director of photography of Paramount's Primate, Stephen Murphy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the movie, I was wondering if you could kind of tell us, like, what is the role of a director of photography or of a cinematographer of a film or show?
Essentially, we make the pictures that you view. Another much more famous cinematographer once said that we're kind of like a visual psychologist, and that we're hopefully using images, using light and composition and color to elicit an emotional response in the audience that maybe you're not fully sort of cognizant of. But it's there nonetheless. And really, what we do is we take the written word, take the script, and we take the director's ideas, and then we bring our own taste to it, and we try and visualize what the director's trying to go for.
Which is kind of cool because, like you said, you're taking the vision and you're making it a reality.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've sort of said before to other people, I think lots of us super geeky people like me are into comic books, and what a DP does is very similar to what a comic book artist does in terms of their relationship with in the comic book, it's just the writer. In the movie or TV show, it's the director and the writer, and that some directors are super visual, and they're super particular about what they're trying to do and where they're trying to, put the camera. And some directors are not visual at all. And then there's a whole spectrum of directors in between, some of them just want to work with the actors, and, they'll hire you specifically to just, do all of the visual side of things. Some directors are, really lens savvy, really tech savvy, and they know how they want to move the camera, what lens they want to shoot on, and where the camera should be at what moment, and how it's all going to cut together. Um, and yeah, like I said, there's a spectrum in the middle then.
So, what is kind of your personal journey into cinematography?
It's slightly unusual. I started off a long time ago. I'm a super geeky guy. I was gonna say I'm a super geeky kid, but now I'm a grown up. But I was a super geeky kid, and I used to draw my own comics, and I love painting and drawing. I built loads of models, and I played a lot of played a lot of D&D and Warhammer, and all that kind of stuff. And I came across a magazine when I was very young, which was about Star Wars, and it was like the story of the movie in pictures, and then it was a section on the making of the movie, and there was loads of photographs of the model makers at ILM building spaceships, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. That's I could do that. That's like a real job, and so anyway, I kind of found my way going to an art school because they had a very particular course at the time, training to be a makeup artist. Because I thought I could do that and then go and make monsters. I could be Rick Baker or Rob Bottin or someone like that.
That's so awesome.
And yeah, it was a great idea at the time. But but while I was doing that, they part of the course was to understand black and white photography. And I had never taken any photographs before. We didn't have a camera in our family home. We weren't There was no video cameras. We had a small stills camera for, family occasions, but the kids weren't allowed to play with us because it was expensive. Um, so that was my introduction to black and white photography, and we would shoot, a couple of rolls of film a week maybe, and then we would would develop and print the photographs ourselves, because there was a lab in the art college, and that blew my mind, and I thought this was amazing. And I while I was in the school, I was there for 2 years. I got the chance to start working on film sets. And some of the times I was building sets, some of the times I was sculpting, costumes or making props or doing prosthetics or makeup. And eventually I got to work on a job where I was doing, miniatures and stuff. Um, but I began to gravitate towards what the guys were doing around the camera. So the conversations around the camera were more interesting to me. They were more story driven, and there was more of a correlation between, like I said, what the cinematographer does and what an artist does in the comic books. And I really like that. I like that, the narrative side of things. So I decided to become a camera assistant, or in the States you'd call it a camera PA. We call it camera trainee over here. It's
Okay.
like the lowest level of the camera department, and then slowly worked my way up through the camera department. Working as an assistant and then an operator, and then eventually became a cinematographer.
I mean, that's an incredible journey, starting from something that was so different to eventually leading to what you're doing now. And you've worked on so many incredible projects. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Hannah, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I mean, upcoming The Gentleman as well. Um, this is all incredible. But specifically with Primate, this does have a really cool kind of visual presence. I remember from the trailer right away, the use of color and the use of shadows was something that had just was something didn't feel like I had seen a lot of that before. So when you began, what was kind of your overall like visual philosophy for Primate?
So for me, I mean, the real interest for me in doing Primate was to do a monster movie because obviously that was the background I had, and I
Sure.
knew they were going to do it with a real, animatronic head and real creature suit and stuff like that. Um, so visually, then I kind of started creating a visual plan based around the idea of making this creature suit look as good as it possibly could, making the cast look really good, but then also having a movie that was sort of moody and scary, but was still visible. You could still see what was going on. And there's been this trend, sort of the last 10 years or so in cinematography about leaning towards naturalism, and in a dark movie naturalism can very quickly become sort of gloom, where there's you can't see a thing or you can barely see a
Yeah.
thing. And I've done that in the past. I've been guilty of doing that. Sometimes it can be amazing and sometimes it can be frustrating. And a lot of the movies that I grew up that I loved were horror movies from the 80s or sci-fi movies from the 80s and 90s, which were dark and moody, but you could still clearly see what you needed to see of the story. So I was doing a sort of a throwback to my memory of what those movies looked like in the 80s and 90s, particularly things like The Thing, stuff that John Carpenter directed or Dean Cundey was the cinematographer on it. I just, yeah, I love that kind of, it was like a moodiness that still had a luminosity to it. So you could still see what you needed to see, but still see plenty of shadows too.
One of fellow writers, when I was kind of asking them like for questions about this, we had a few that reviewed this, and one of them had asked about the homages paid to past films. It felt like,
Mhm.
and he
Mhm.
was specifically talking about like a car chase scene that felt like it was from like a Wes Craven like 80s movie, and so it's
Right.
cool to hear that there really was the kind of that, and like there was that homage paid to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, the specific things in the movie where Johannes was trying to specifically homage certain things. But there's also, you know, you can't help but be influenced by your sort of formative, influences when you were growing up. And I think that's always there in your taste levels, and you're always kind of, sort of doing the work that you can do, but filtered through those eyes that you first saw the thing with, or first, saw, Halloween with, or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So for this project, how did you use
Mhm.
light to kind of create suspense rather than relying on a lot of jump scares?
So a lot of the way I will work is I try and, figure out the real logic of where the light could be or should be. And then it's me modulating that sort of taste so that I have the shadows where I want them and things like that. So it's kind of like a hyper realism, So,
Okay.
we're in a space that has, lots of huge windows, and we're at nighttime, so I know that the moon is outside and it's going to come in. But maybe I'm just shaping it so that it doesn't flood the room with light. It, drops off at a certain point and there's shadowy corners there, or, the flickering TV is on this side instead of on that side of the room. So I'm trying to stage the action as well so that the camera is always in what I would call the shadow side. So if
Okay.
I'm looking at a person, I don't want to be looking at a person and seeing them flatly lit. I want to be on the side of their face where the shadows are falling, so you can see the dimensionality of their face, and so you can feel and appreciate both the lit part of the face and the shadowy side of the face.
That's a kind of a really cool technique because it does add. My day job is a psychologist, so it does add to like that feeling off kilter a little bit, as you're, like for the audience
Yeah.
as you're watching that.
Yeah. You kind of need to, I have this sort of phrase that I say it out loud on set all the time, but I certainly say it to myself a lot. You need to leave room for the music, and you need to leave room for the audience to bring something, to project something, especially in a horror movie. So by having enough shadow and enough shape in the frame, it gives the audience something to want to see in the shadows, whether it's really there or not, that's something else. But I think if you illuminate everything, there's no real room for questions. There's no room for, it's absolute. It's like, yeah, I can definitely see that. I can definitely see that. And I think the more interesting space is when, you can't see everything. You can suggest stuff. We can sketch things with light, but not fully illuminate.
Now, when it comes to setting up a scene kind of like that, is it like a process of like you move all the pieces and then it's like ready to go, or is there times where you have to kind of stop and like look back and be like, okay, let's move it here, let's change this, let's develop it a little differently as you're kind of taking those scenes in.
Depends entirely on the director and the project.
Okay,
Everything is different, which is the kind of joy of the job as well, that every collaboration is very different. And you could have the same director, but with different cast members. They operate differently, or they need to operate differently to allow for the way different people work and stuff like that.
sure.
Um, but in general, what you try and do is, you know the work that you're going to have to do that day, and you turn up in the morning, and before every scene, the director is a private rehearsal with the actors, and they sort of have a bit of time to figure out what they're going to do. And sometimes I get to sit in on that, and I kind of watch what they're doing, and then I get to have a chat with the director about, the way the actors are blocking, or moving around the set, and what they're trying to achieve. And then you maybe go, okay, look, if you're trying to do this, then it would be better if we could move the actors over here at this point, or if he or she moves here at this point, and then you sort of figure it out that way. And then usually you set up a wide shot, some kind of a wide master that works
Okay.
for some or most of the scene, and then you decide, actually, we need this piece a little bit closer, or we need this piece a little bit closer. And some directors are different. Some directors will go into a scene knowing that they only want to get one particular moment. That's the moment they're focused on, and then you do that first, and then they work their way backwards. Work from the inside out rather than the outside in. So, but it's just different. Every job is different.
And then could that change even day to day as well too? Like on the same project, like this shot needs to be handled a little differently than this shot, or
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, again, you might have like on a lot of movies or shows, you might have a specific sequence that is maybe technically complex, or slightly different from the norm, and you will approach that more with a different mindset than maybe a conventional, oh hey, we're all sitting down having dinner conversation. So again, it just depends. Like I did a movie last year called Heart Eyes, and there was a very specific kill shot that's in the trailer of a camera that sees two couples and then tracks back through a gaping wound in someone's neck to
yes.
reveal the person who was killed, right? And that was something the director had in mind from the very, very beginning. That was like a very kind of crucial way of telling that story. And so on that day's work, obviously you're going into that work knowing that that's how you want to execute that, and it's technically very complex. So you're all working towards that common goal of executing that shot. But if you were doing another scene that might be something more performance based or something super emotional, the technical takes, like maybe a back seat, and you're watching the performance first, and you're in the rehearsal, and then you're going, okay, the best way for us to capture that performance is like this.
Absolutely. Okay. This movie also uses a lot of color, and I think that's always very interesting for horror films. How do you like use certain colors symbolically in Primate to kind of help maybe tell a certain scene, or to tell the help tell the movie?
So for me, I use color um, in a, well, I would call it a way that's maybe I don't it's probably quite instinctive for me. But what I think I gravitate towards is using, color contrast.
Okay.
So I might have an idea that, oh, okay, I want the night scenes to be cold, or therefore the opposite of that is a warmer color, and we should use that for these scenes as a contrast to those scenes. Or I might work it, backwards. Or, I might look at, say, Ben's t-shirt, which is red, and go, okay, you know what would be a really nice counterpoint to that is if everything else is cold and blue, and then the red is the only red, and it pops. Um, you sort of like, well, I approach things a little bit like that.
I was gonna say that I the in this film, the pool versus like
Hmm.
like that bright blue, it really
Hmm.
just gave it such a distinct feeling of
Hmm.
like it felt very unique, you know? Again, you don't see that like it just pops and everything else is kind of dark and moody, but then you have this like bright almost
Hmm.
at never-ending pool of water. That it was just a
Yeah.
really cool visual.
Yeah, I was quite keen that the pool became its own light source. We built all the lights into the pool. We played around with the colors in prep. We knew that we were going to have those string lights kind of above the pool, and they were going to be a warmer color, and we were going to have those lights on the rocky wall, which is already kind of warmer. And I wanted it to pop out. I wanted it to have its, a very clear, distinctive look. So I leant towards a colder color, but I also knew we were doing the blue moonlight, thing for the rest of the movie. So we made sure that we could get a pool light that was, a little more kind of like cyany and was sat in a different color spectrum to what we were doing with the moonlight. And yeah, it worked really well.
Absolutely. And also this film feels very almost claustrophobic in a way, you feel like you're almost holding onto
Hmm.
your breath. How do you achieve that feel as well through cinematography?
So for me, a lot of that is about the lensing,
Okay,
and how much of the set you show and the aspect ratio that we're using. So I'm a huge fan of anamorphic lenses, which gives you that rectangular 240 aspect ratio. And a lot of the movies that I would have loved as a kid were all shot with Panavision anamorphic lenses. So that's my sort of the first thing I reach for when I'm starting a project. To me, that's cinema. So I'm always trying to shoot with those lenses if I can. The great thing about anamorphic is, if you use wider lenses, you can feel the edges of the set, or you can feel the set and the edges of the frame rather. And we're very keen, or I was very keen to always feel that space encroaching on the characters.
sure.
I think, especially in a movie like this, which is all in one location essentially, but the location often is another character in a movie, and it often helps you describe, how characters behave. If you think about taking those characters and placing them in a something, in a hospital, you'd have a very different feeling in a middle of a World War I battlefield. They behave in very different ways. So watching them bump up against the physicality of the environment is a really great way to kind of understand some of their character and some of their behavior.
Sure.
So for me, it was really important to just feel that space. It was a great space to shoot in. It's a really unique looking house. It's all glass and vertical beams and quite open ceilings and stuff that are also slanted, which made it really tricky to shoot in. But it was a really interesting way to present the characters and be able to be outside the building and look into them, and be inside and not quite see what's outside unless you're right
Sure.
up against the glass. We could play with that, which was good fun.
Which it definitely that brought the fear just a little bit. I never thought of a house with just all windows, being terrifying, but
Mhm.
you're right. You got to play with a lot of those things, and I'm sure as much as that maybe was a challenge, but that also had to be quite fun in this role that you have.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like there's that great sequence or a great shot where the guys arrive, halfway through the movie, and one of them sort of like goes right up to the glass to check his reflection, and then you just feel Ben outside, and he leans in, and then you see him in the light. It's playing with that thing of you're inside your house, the lights are on, you feel safe, but actually you're super exposed to whatever is outside, but you just don't realize it. So it's a lot of fun.
Is there a shot that you're especially proud of from Primate?
If it was a single shot, I think it's the shot, which again I think is in the trailer, of Ben through the reeded glass door,
Sure.
which is just beautifully distorted and impressionistic, and it's gorgeous. Um, but there's lots of sequences that I'm really proud of. I mean, one of the trickiest ones to shoot was the girls end up, they go from the pool, they go up the stairs, they kind of carefully step through the living room with the TVs, and then they have to hide in the closet. And like shooting that sequence in a tiny closet, was tricky. And
Sure.
but we made it work, and it turned out really well. Um, but it was definitely tricky.
Now, when it comes to that, did you kind of have an idea of like this is how we should do it, or was it like in the moment you're like, okay, and this is how we're gonna get in that closet, you know?
So when we were doing that, there were specific sort of visual ideas that Johannes was trying to get, the idea of seeing the monkey maw kind of push through in foreground while the girls were kind of behind it and stuff like that. So we were always chasing those kind of moments, but no, scenes usually sort of when you look at the rehearsal, you see things that ideas that present themselves. Part of the job is trying to be present on the set so that instead of being there going, oh well, I know what the script says and I know what we should be doing, you're actually looking at it going, oh, you know what, this is actually what's happening, this is what's actually happening here, and that actor's doing something really interesting with their hands. We should see that, and maybe we should use that. You're recognizing things that could be interesting visuals,
Sure.
that could help develop the story, and you're trying to respond to those a little bit too. So we always knew we were going to, take that journey with the cast. They were going to end up in the closet. We had the closet, built in a way that we could get the camera in there. It was very tight for space, but we had a plan. But you're also trying to, get not just the plan. You're trying to get the plan plus.
Right. There's always like like we have our action sheets, but there's always something that just outside out that might be a better way to achieve that goal or to a better visual and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Like I said, the thing is to try and see the movie or the story that's actually in front of you,
Mhm.
which is sometimes slightly different from what you think it should be based on the script on the page.
That's such an awesome. I mean, this is such a cool job. Just one final question then for you is just what do you hope audiences subconsciously feel because of your cinematography?
Um, I would like them obviously to feel scared. I would like them to feel, trapped in the way that maybe when you're watching Jaws in a theater, you feel trapped when the camera's in the water, Um, but I also, I love I go to the movies for escapism. That's what, I always have done as a child. So I hope they feel a little bit of, I guess, wonder as well, in that
Sure.
they kind of like marvel at it a little bit, or they don't think about, the mechanics of it all. They just dig the movie.
Which I here in Michigan, people have been raving about this movie. So I think that that is
Great.
exactly what people are walking away with is just how awesome this film is. And so, thank you for the incredible work that you've done, and thank you for being here to talk
Thank
about
you.
it. We're so thankful to have you here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.